What's this book? Nothing. This is nothing. It's just a book, really. And please, I must ask that you respect my private moments and not intrude in this way. It's just a book. I read it to improve my command of the English language. There's really nothing else to it. Well, of course, there I'm referencing a very dramatic moment between our protagonist, Mr. Stevens, and his colleague and close friend and associate, Miss Kenton, although the nature of their relationship takes on new meaning for Mr. Stevens, as you know, during his 6-day journey to the West Country, during which time he reflects in depth on significant moments from Miss Kenton's tenure at Darlington Hall. Well, more on that in a little bit. Just wanted to check in with everyone in self-service and first of all express my sincere appreciation for the great work that you are doing. We're now a week and a half into this new distance learning, and I have been truly impressed with the quality of your participation in the Zoom meetings and in your study question responses, which show a real attention to Ishiguro's language and what Ishiguro is accomplishing here in the remains of the day, which is quite subtle. And what I'm specifically referring to is the journey that Mr. Stevens takes psychologically while he's taking this physical journey to the West Country to reunite with Miss Kenton after 20 years. The psychological journey is one that he takes through his memories, and it results in a kind of emerging new understanding of past events and relationships. All of a sudden on this trip, he's not working and he has time on his hands during which he can reflect on significant moments. So in particular, I'd like to take a look at one topic from the second set of study questions, and that's the relationship between Mr. Stevens and Miss Kenton. More than half of the study questions, set 2, are related to this relationship. And your responses, again, were very thoughtful, but I want to maybe bring home a particular point here, and that is that for Mr. Stevens, during the period in which he and Miss Kenton were working together, in really from the early 1920s to maybe the mid 1930s, he is so committed to his professional work that he doesn't really allow himself to think about why Miss Kenton might be behaving in the way that she does toward him. So let's go back into the text here, and I want to point out a few different pages to you as we reconsider their relationship and what these memories that Mr. Stephen has reveal about what Miss Kenton might have been feeling during that time. So the first one is on page 147. We're reminded that on a nightly basis, Miss Kenton would host Mr. Stevens in her parlor for hot cocoa and discussions. Discussions which were, according to Mr. Stevens, strictly professional in nature, and yet he does admit that they would touch on informal topics and that the conversations were, quote, predominantly professional in character, which suggests to me that at times they tended to discuss other matters that were perhaps more personal or social in nature. Specifically on page 157, when Miss Kenton teases Mr. Stevens for not hiring attractive young women on his staff, and that maybe he's flesh and blood after all, that he can't control himself. She's teasing him about perhaps being a a man after all, being a human being with feelings and urges. And Mr. Stevens, as the narrator, is quick to note that they would not have talked like this in the presence of anyone else on the staff, but that such harmless banter did a lot to relieve the stresses of a busy day. And so he acknowledges that their relationship is moving into this uncharted territory. A year after the dismissal of the two Jewish maids, Ruth and Sarah, Mr. Stevens, as you know, goes to Miss Kenton and tells her that Lord Darlington regrets the decision, that he would like to reach out to Ruth and Sarah, which unfortunately they can't do, and we're left to wonder about the fate of Ruth and Sarah. Were they perhaps sent to a concentration camp, or would that be their fate? And Miss Kenton says to Mr. Stevens how much it would have meant to me if you had thought to share your feelings at the time. So she's kind of frustrated with him for not telling her, this was a year ago when he dismissed Ruth and Sarah at Lord Darlington's order, that he would have, his sharing his feelings would have really meant a lot to her. So she's reaching out to him there and reminding him of the importance he plays in her life. On page 164, Mr. Stevens, the narrator, admits to us that there were 3 different occasions in which Miss Kenton attempted to bring flowers to him in his room to brighten things up. And just pause and think about the significance of that and what flowers signify, and what a bold move it was on Miss Kenton's part, especially a second and third time after being rebuffed earlier. And then, of course, this is what I opened with, the book episode, where Mr. Stevens is reading what he calls or Miss Kenton calls a sentimental romance, and Miss Kenton approaches him. Let's take a look at the bottom of page 166, and I just want to read 2 paragraphs with you and would ask you to either listen carefully or read along. The bottom of page 166. Then she was standing before me, and suddenly the atmosphere underwent a peculiar change, almost as though the two of us had been suddenly thrust onto some other plane of being altogether. I am afraid it is not easy to describe clearly what I mean here. All I can say is that everything around us suddenly became very still. It was my impression that Miss Kenton's manner also underwent a sudden change. There was a strange seriousness in her expression, and it struck me she seemed almost frightened. Please, Mr. Stevens, let me see your book. She reached forward and began gently to release the volume from my grasp. I judged it best to look away while she did so, but with her person positioned so closely, this could only be achieved by my twisting my head away at a somewhat unnatural angle. Miss Kenton continued very gently to prise the book away, practically 1 finger at a time. The process seemed to take a very long time, throughout which I managed to maintain my posture, until finally I heard her say, "Good gracious, Mr. Stevens, it isn't anything so scandalous at all, simply a sentimental love story." So a few details from that passage that I would call your attention to. Of course, they're entering a kind of different plane of being altogether, and how this is a new sensation for Mr. Stevens, something akin to physical attraction, perhaps even love. He can't really identify it because he's never experienced anything like that before. He's never allowed himself to. And then the physical act of Miss Kenton prying Mr. Stevens' fingers 1 at a time off the book. There's something incredibly strange yet intimate about that moment. So there's my daughter Louisa in the background. Lou, you can wave. There you go. I'm just finishing up. So I think that's a good place to end. And of course, at this point, you've finished reading the novel. And in our next Zoom meeting on Tuesday, we can talk about the end of the novel. Yeah. Do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi.
Let me just finish what I'm saying
Daddy,
right here, okay?
Daddy, so,
Hold on 1 minute.
No, in the backyard, in the vent, there's another wasp nest.
Okay, I'll spray the wasps. Okay.
In that same vent.
Okay, I'll get them.
They love that vent.
We have a wasp infestation in our backyard, and Daddy Duty calls here. But when we get to the end of the remains of the day, we realize these suspicions or this growing feeling that we have about Miss Kenton's perhaps love for Mr. Stevens when she actually admits that she could have imagined a life together, and that feeling of dissatisfaction with her life results in her from time to time actually leaving her husband. So more to come on that. I'm trying to streamline things on Canvas more so than via email, including the next set of study questions, which I just posted. So hope you all are having a great weekend, and I'll see you soon.